Welcome everyone to our penultimate Garrod seminar of the Michaelmas term, which, just to let you know, will be recorded and available on YouTube afterwards, and we'll be taking questions either through chat or by waving frantically, whichever appears to be working better. There's 70 of you out there. It's great to see you all, and it's a great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Emma Pomeroy, who since January 2019 has been our lecturer in the evolution of health, diet and disease. Emma has a long history at Cambridge as a student and then as a JRF at Newnham, after which she left to John Moores University in Liverpool for a Lever Humani Career Fellowship, followed by a lectureship in biological anthropology. To our immense benefit, we were able to entice her back, and she's proven, of course, entirely unsurprisingly, to be an outstanding colleague and teacher and researcher back within the department ever since. She works across a very impressive range of time periods and questions, and there's only one among many of which is her subject today, as recently featured in Antiquity: New Neanderthal discoveries at Shanidar Cave, Iraqi Kurdistan. Emma, over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Cyprian. Yes, so just before I get started, I just want to mention to everyone that I will be showing some images of human skeletal remains. So if you might find that problematic, please take this as due warning. So today I'm going to be speaking about some of the work that I've been doing with a team from the University of Cambridge and elsewhere, and I'll expand on that a bit later, at the site of Shanidar Cave in Iraqi Kurdistan, and particularly focusing on the new discoveries that we've made of Neanderthal remains. Shanidar Cave is one of the iconic Palaeolithic sites. This is the cave here. It's in the foothills of the Bardos Mountains in northern Iraq, in the Kurdish region. And as you can see, it's rather a large cave. The fence here, just for scale, is a little taller than most adults, so very large limestone cave, as I mentioned, in the foothills of the Bardos Mountains and looking out towards a major river, the Greater Zab. It's provided evidence for a range of aspects of human evolution and behaviour, right from the Neanderthals through to some of the earliest agriculturalists in the region. I'm going to be focusing today on some of the Neanderthal remains because that's probably what this site is most famous for and what I've been part of investigating. So just as a refresher for you, Neanderthals are some of our closest evolutionary relatives. The skull shown here on the right compared to modern humans shown here on the left. So modern humans much more gracile and lightly built, both in the skull and the rest of the body. Neanderthals evolved about perhaps 400,000 years ago in Eurasia and have a very wide geographic spread, surviving to about 40,000 years ago and going extinct around the time that modern humans are making sort of a permanent and more established appearance in Eurasia. So there's been much discussion about what modern human role might have been in the extinction of the Neanderthals, and also a long history of characterizing them really as less sophisticated, less intelligent than us. But this idea has changed, particularly within the last couple of decades. And we've also had evidence from the genetic side of things that humans and Neanderthals probably interbred. So our picture about them is changing a great deal. And Shanidar Cave and the evidence that's come out of Shanidar Cave has played a major role in this reinterpretation of our close evolutionary relatives. It's particularly famous for the work conducted by Ralph Solecki, an American archaeologist, between 1951 and 1960. So this is Ralph Solecki here at Shanidar with the physical anthropologist on the project, T. Dale Stewart. And over these years, Solecki excavated a large 20-metre long trench in the centre of the cave. So this is a plan of the cave on the bottom left here. Here's the mouth of the cave, and here's Solecki's trench in the centre. All around it were the residences of nomadic herders who were actually living there at the time. And this is a photograph from the archives of one of their huts. And he conducted substantial excavations right down to bedrock at 14 meters depths in part of the cave, in the central part, with the help of a large team of local workmen, and some of them are shown here on the top right. His work there was influential. As I mentioned, there are remains spanning from the Neanderthals through to some of the earliest agriculturalists in the region. And actually his wife, Ralph Solecki, conducted excavations nearby at Zawi Shemi Shanidar into some of these early agricultural settlements. But it's perhaps most famous for the discovery of the remains of 10 Neanderthal men, women, and children. Not only because these finds contribute to our understanding of morphological variation, the geographic range of this species, but also to aspects of their behaviour. So for example, Shanidar 1 shown here is very well known because he'd suffered multiple injuries during his life and yet survived very well. So it's suggested that he'd actually had some compassion and support from members of his community. So he'd suffered, amongst other things, a massive head injury to the left side of the head just here, and paralysis and probably loss of the lower part of the right arm. So this is the right humerus here, upper arm bone on the left, compared to his left bone on the right. And you can see that the right is rather withered in appearance, and this is a sign that it's not been particularly well used and was likely paralysed. In the case of Shanidar 3, we've got some clear evidence of another kind of injury, a projectile injury, and this happened some time before death. So you can see here this little groove in the rib with the bone growing up around it, and again suggests perhaps interpersonal violence, although the interpretation is somewhat controversial, and perhaps also compassion because this individual was able to survive. And perhaps most famously, we have the individual referred to as Shanidar 4, or the flower burial. And Solecki argued on the basis of clusters of pollen that were found around the bones that this individual was intentionally buried with flowers placed around the body. So the work of Solecki himself, but also others that he worked alongside, was very instrumental in shaping some of our ideas and shaping debates over the subsequent decades about Neanderthal behaviour. So for example, Solecki made a strong argument for a very human-like Neanderthal society where there was compassion and this ritual and emotional, perhaps, treatment of the dead. This was based in part on the work of Arlette Leroy-Gorin, the paleontologist who worked on the samples from Shanidar, and found there were these clusters of pollen around the Shanidar 4 bones, which were most easily, in her interpretation, explained as whole flowers having been placed around the body. There was also very seminal work done by T. Dale Stewart, who I've mentioned previously, and then subsequently Eric Trinkhaus on the analysis of the skeletal remains themselves. And these analyses really have shaped our understanding of Neanderthal life, health, variation, and biology. In particular, there's been a lot of discussion about the Shanidar evidence in relation to mortuary behaviour and funerary behaviour. So there's been a long-standing debate as to the cognitive capacities of Neanderthals and whether they treated their dead in a sort of ritual and symbolic way. And that's the distinction perhaps that we can make between mortuary behaviour on the one hand, which might be treatment of the dead body, but just with perhaps practical motivations, versus funerary behaviour, where the treatment of the dead body is imbued with some kind of symbolic significance. And there's been a great deal of debate as to when this characteristic, this treatment of the dead with symbolism, evolved in our hominin lineage, because it can tell us something quite significant about ways of thinking, cognitive capacity, and how past peoples have interpreted the landscape. So some of the debate focused around the question of specifically burial, but it's really important that we take a wider view and talk about funerary behaviour more generally. Because if we look across modern human populations, or recent human populations, what we see is actually a huge variation in what's done with the dead. This can vary from sky burials, and we have a couple of examples here from native North America and the Himalaya, from burial in rivers to the kind of inhumation that we're most familiar with, cremation, even preservation of the body. And we have an example of a pre-ceramic Chinchorro mummy here from the coast of Chile, and also other kind of reuses of the skeleton. So what seems to unite human behaviour is not necessarily burial, it's about that symbolic treatment of the dead, which reflects concepts of the society about perhaps the afterlife. It might reflect compassion to fellow beings, and usually carries a heavily symbolic element. So by looking at these characteristics, we can perhaps infer these behaviours and try and understand these behaviours in the past and when they evolved. Equally, it can help us understand something about how the landscape was interpreted and used and conceptualised by populations in the past. If we think about perhaps the model we're most familiar with, cemeteries, there we have a specially dedicated place that we associate with the dead, both physically and symbolically. And perhaps if we see the same thing in the archaeological record related to, say, Neanderthal behaviour, we can make similar inferences about how they thought about and interacted with their landscape. So in terms of Solecki's interpretations of the Shanidar Neanderthals, in particularly relation to mortuary behaviour, there are a number of interpretations that he put forward. He suggested that some individuals were killed actually by natural rockfall, so were natural deaths. That some had piles of stones intentionally placed over the body, particularly Shanidar 1. That there may have been ritual feasting associated with the deposition of bodies, in the case of Shanidar 1 and 5, and then the flower burial, which I already mentioned. What's less often discussed with the flower burial is the fact that actually this was part of a cluster of 4 individuals. So also we've got some potential ideas here about multiple burial and perhaps secondary burial. And these interpretations were really quite pioneering and game-changing at their time. However, they're somewhat tricky in the present because although Solecki's work really was seminal, over the decades, obviously in any academic field, our standards of evidence change, our theoretical background and basis change, and the way we look and interpret evidence changes. So to some extent, some of the evidence that he was able to draw on and present can be rather easily dismissed. And it can be a bit easy to say, actually, we can explain this all away by natural processes. And that's been one of the big problems with trying to understand Neanderthal or other hominin mortuary behaviour, is that quite often we're looking back at older excavations, trying to reinterpret evidence from a modern perspective based on excavations done to a different standard with different available techniques. And that can be really difficult to really come to firm conclusions. While some of the evidence might be rather easily dismissed, at the same time, it's quite often taken at face value, repeated and repeated across different publications still today, without actually critically assessing whether those interpretations hold up to scrutiny. So there's huge potential here for the contributions both of new evidence but also new analyses to help us move this debate around Neanderthal mortuary and funerary behaviour forward, and think about more complex questions about, what if it is symbolic, what does that symbolism reflect? Is it something to do with the status of individuals? Can we see evidence for important places in the landscape? So In relation to moving this debate forward with the Shanidar cave evidence, since 2011, there have been new excavations at the cave led by Professor Graeme Barker, re-investigating Ralph Solecki's original trench. So here we've got a sequence of photos showing his excavations in 1960. They became backfilled over the years, and despite the fact that Solecki tried to go back and continue, this was not possible for various political and logistic reasons. In 2011, Professor Graeme Barker was invited by the Kurdish regional government to recommence excavations at this key site and to try and bring the whole range of modern archaeological science to bear on that existing evidence and to complement the sort of large-scale excavations that Solecki had achieved with perhaps a finer scale but much more detailed analysis of things like the chronology, environmental evidence, to really help us understand much better the behaviour and changes of behaviour within both Neanderthal populations using the cave, but also their modern human successors. Another major source of evidence is the archives that have been left by Ralph and Rose Solecki. Until recently, these have not been available, but they have, in the last few years, been accessioned to the National Anthropological Archives at the Smithsonian Institution. There's an entry from their blog here on the left describing the process and some of the amazing things that are within this archive. It's really huge. It's in excess of 90 boxes, and they've spent several years cataloguing just the Shanidar material. It includes many unpublished photos, things like field notebooks, drawings, sketches, observations that have not really been published in detail. And so this is a really rich repository for us to be able to reconsider some of those original interpretations and that original evidence. So just down here in this photo at the bottom, you can see staff from the Smithsonian working with Ralph Solecki and his wife Rose. As I mentioned, both were archaeologists working in this region. Ralph sadly died just over a year and a half ago, but this transfer of their personal archives to a public available repository offers real huge research potential. And then, of course, as I've hinted at before, we have new methods, new theoretical frameworks, new understandings of things like the processes that lead to accumulation of sediments, that affect the preservation of remains, particularly in caves, that we can bring to bear on this evidence as well, and perhaps shed new light on some of these questions that we have about what the remains and the finds mean. So I've just put up a few examples here, new dating techniques. So this is some readings taken in relation to OSL dating at the site, soil micromorphology, new approaches to interpreting the skeletal remains themselves, so approaches such as archaeothanatology, but also a better understanding of skeletal taphonomy, which I'll come back to. New analyses we can do on the remains themselves, things like analysis of dental calculus and potentially ancient DNA and proteomics. And some of the new remains that we've found do have some of the best parts of the skeleton for preserving ancient DNA intact. So here you can see a CT scan of the petrous part of the temple bone, which is one of the best places for extracting DNA. And it would be very exciting if we were able to gain Neanderthal DNA from this part of the world, because no attempts have yet been successful. Other field techniques as well, such as wet sieving to recover all those sort of tiny microscopic lines of evidence for things like environment and behaviour. So building on that project that really started in the field in 2015, are two ongoing projects. So one is work that I've been doing along with my colleague Lucy Farr, thanks to a British Academy grant, which is enabling us to go and make use of the Solecki archives, which were available for research for the first time last summer. So it really is a new development. And you can see us here when we were visiting the archives. We went to visit Ralph Solecki, and this is us with her and Ralph's son, John. We've also recently been awarded funding from the Templeton Foundation to enable us to continue some of the analyses of the skeletal remains themselves, and hopefully reanalyze some of the older skeletal remains and conduct new excavations to continue these new discoveries at Shanidar. So I want to give you just a couple of examples of how we're applying these methods and these approaches, both with the archives and with the new excavations, to try and help improve our interpretations of some of the Shanidar skeletal evidence. So I'm going to focus first on Shanidar 1. If you remember, he was that individual who had quite extensive injuries during his lifetime that probably led to partial paralysis. He was also fairly deaf, but lived to a good old age. So Solecki's interpretation of this individual was that he was struck by rockfall on the head, which made him fall backwards. So this is the skeleton lying here on the right. You can see the feet at the bottom here, rather disturbed leg bones, and then up through to the upper body. The skull was just here where the star is and had been removed at this point because it was found first and needed to be removed to protect it before the rest was uncovered. This is the skull in situ here, so the cranium and mandible, and a drawing of those remains in place. So Solecki went on to suggest that the reason the head was somewhat over to one side and in this odd position was that it had been severed from his trunk by falling rockfall. He then mentioned that there are a couple of concentrations of animal bones that might reflect a funerary feast for the dead, and that the body had then been covered with loose stones, and then subsequently rockfall had happened over the top. This is one of the published plans of that rockfall over the top of Shanidar 1 skeleton. So I should probably actually say this is the supposedly placed rocks over the body. And this would be very significant because it suggests some kind of, active and potentially symbolic treatment of the body. Up here in the right is a line drawing of that skeleton in place, and the red star just shows you the same datum point so that you can line up where the stones overlie the body. One of the problems we have, though, is that across the centre of the roof of the cave is a massive geological fault. So this is looking up from inside the trench. This is kind of a panoramic view looking straight upwards. And you can see this huge fault where there's been regular rockfall coming down, particularly in colder periods. These three pictures of or views of the site, again, you can pick out these layers of substantial rockfall interspersed with sediment. So of course, one of the questions here is, well, how can we be sure that those rocks that Solecki interpreted as intentionally placed actually were? Because you get some parts of the site where there are huge amounts of rockfall, and there's not really sufficient evidence to back up that claim. Also, can we actually be sure that these associations between, say, the skeletons, the rocks, potentially hards, and these animal bones that were interpreted as evidence of feasting are actually such, or can they be better explained in another way? This is where some of the archival evidence comes in. So where Shanidar 1 has been fully excavated, but as I mentioned, we have this amazing repository of extensive unpublished information. Here's one of Ralph's notebooks with details about the finding of Shanidar 1. And here what we've got are plans drawn on transparent material, lucite, at I think it's every foot of depth, showing the distribution of rocks, of animal bones, and also the Neanderthal remains. And these are so valuable because this gives us a chance to actually look at and analyse the distribution of rocks of different sizes, their grouping, to try and say, could that accumulation be natural? Or can this only be explained by Neanderthal human intervention? And so these plans that I've picked out here, this is the layer of rocks directly above Shanidar 1, and this is the layer below showing the Shanidar 1 remains in situ. Another approach that we can use to try and reassess the validity of some of these interpretations is looking at bone breakage and taphonomy. So our understanding of how bones break and what that can tell us about their history has really come a long way since Solecki's time. It's been well demonstrated that living or relatively fresh bone, because of its high collagen content, retains some flexibility and so breaks in quite a different way to bone that's been in the ground for some time, or that has been exposed, that's lost its collagen and so become brittle. And so we've got examples here. So here's a fresh bone that has been broken. You can see the nature of the fracture is kind of spiral around the bone, and the edges of the break itself are rather angled. Compared with the break on dry bone, where you can see the break is much more horizontal in nature and has a kind of stepped and more ragged kind of an edge. And by carefully looking at breakage patterns and the nature of the breaks, we can get some really valuable insights into mortuary behaviour, but other aspects of the history, the taphonomy of those remains. And this has been demonstrated really nicely by work from a colleague, Noemi Sala, at Cima de los Huesos in Spain, where they've looked in detail at these breakage patterns to better understand the nature of the deposits of remains there. So by bringing this approach to bear on the Shanidar 1 remains, alongside analysis of the distribution of stones and things like this, we can hopefully bring much more solid evidence to help refute or support those interpretations that Solecki put out in his works. My second example is going to be, of course, the Shanidar 4 flower burial, which is known by many, even outside the field. So here is the flower burial in situ. Hopefully you can see here's the hips, the lower limbs, the rib cage. Here was the skull and the arms folded up in front of the face. So here's a line drawing of that and where these various soil samples were taken from. In the analysis of those, Arlette Leroy-Gorin discovered clusters of pollen from at least 7 species. And as I mentioned before, this was interpreted as evidence of the placement of whole flowers around the body that had been intentionally buried. This was quite controversial at the time, and debate over subsequent decades suggested other explanations for this. This included that perhaps burrowing rodents, particularly Gerds, were responsible for bringing that pollen into the burial environment. There are areas in the cave where there are rodent burrows, and Gerds today are known to drag whole flowers down into their burrows. So that was argued as an explanation that might negate this flower burial hypothesis. Others have suggested it's modern contamination. Like I said, Solecki had this big team of workmen working with him, traipsing in and out every day. There were people living in the cave. And Solecki actually notes himself that some of the workmen like to wear flowers in their belts. So perhaps they introduced the pollen. And for many, this idea of the flower burial has really been substantially weakened. I've not got time to go into lots of detail about this, but there's some really fascinating correspondence from Arlette in the Solecki archive about the critique of her work and her exchanges with Solecki about why that critique doesn't stand up, in her opinion. As I mentioned, what's less discussed is that Shanidar 4 is actually part of a cluster of individuals. So Shanidar 4 was an adult male, about 30 to 45 years at the time of death. His skeleton was extremely fragile, and Dale Stewart, who you can see here, decided with Solecki and the team that the best way to lift the skeleton was on block, which means taking the entire block of sediment with the skeleton still in, out whole, and then taking it to a lab so that you can excavate under more controlled conditions. And so here you can see them placing boards all around that block of sediment. It is quite destructive because you have to sort of dig down around the sides and underneath, place the boards. You then pour in plaster as well, and we've actually found traces of this plaster in the Shanidar 4 area. It was then carried out of the cave, transported to Baghdad, some of the way on the roof of a taxi. So you can imagine that it was probably not in a particularly great state by the time it reached the lab in Baghdad. And this is what Dale Stewart himself records. So he said a couple of years later, when he went to finish excavating the remains, they were essentially very, very jumbled up and very fragmented. So he couldn't really tell what the relationship between the different individuals in that block were. And unfortunately, at the time of excavation, they didn't really realise there were multiple individuals there. There was perhaps a hint of bones of another individual below Shanidar 4. And as they cut down around that block, they record that there were sort of bones falling down as they cut out, which couldn't have belonged to Shanidar 4. So they knew there must be something else there, but they didn't know the extent. So when it came to it, all that Stewart was able to see in situ was part of the legs and the feet of this individual. And he describes them as being roughly here in relation to Shanidar 4. There's other descriptions from Solecki and from Stewart that suggest there was a right arm here behind the head of Shanidar 4 as well. He records that the remains were in proximate anatomical position, but unfortunately, the relationships between these individuals couldn't be discerned. So it's not clear whether they were put there at the same time, whether they died on the spot of natural causes at the same time, or whether they were perhaps placed there at very different times, which would suggest that perhaps Neanderthals are coming back to one same spot within that very large cave to deposit their dead, which could be quite significant in terms of how we think about their conception of landscape and their use of landscape and relationship to the dead. So in his interpretation, what Solecki argued was that basically a crypt was dug amongst some rocks, and this is where the individuals were buried. There was part of an infant, so Shanidar 9, at the bottom. So he said that was placed first, and then these two other individuals, Shanidar 6 and 8, were placed there. Because the remains were quite jumbled as they saw them, he suggested it was a secondary burial, and that the male Shanidar 4 was kind of this primary burial in the centre, with sort of almost offerings of the remains of other individuals around him. Stewart was a bit more reserved in his interpretations, and he said basically we've got very little to go on, and who knows. So one of the exciting things to have come out of our recent excavations is actually the discovery of new Neanderthal remains associated with that cluster and the Shanidar 4 flower burial. So on this picture on the right here, you can see Solecki's excavations, and here's Dale Stewart actually excavating Shanidar 4. On the left is a photo from our more recent excavations, and hopefully you can more or less make out that these are taken from a similar angle and quite comparable. And down here, where my colleague, Professor Chris Hunt, is taking a close look, are some Neanderthal remains in that original section that was excavated by Solecki. If we go to the archive, we can also be very confident that these remains relate to that original Shanidar 4, 6, 8 and 9 cluster. So if we look at this photo here on the left, you can see the block being prepared for removal, and here's Shanidar 4 in the middle, Ralph Solecki again and Dale Stewart here. And there's a couple of really distinctive features about this area of the excavation. This kind of natural channel running here, this large block behind Stewart, and also this sort of triangular looking stone just behind his hand. On the photo on the right, I've highlighted the area where you can see these lots of dark little dots. And that is the distribution of the new Neanderthal remains. And we can see here very clearly that same natural kind of shaft, the triangular rock, which turned out on excavation not to be very triangular, but seems to have sort of kept its name in the way we discuss it, and this larger rock above. This is where that block with Shanidar 4 was taken out. So we can be very confident that these remains are in situ right next to where Shanidar 4 and the other individuals were removed. What this means is a really exciting opportunity to actually investigate this, or at least part of this cluster of individuals anew, and try and answer some of the questions we have about, for example, were they buried together? Were they articulated? Were they secondary burials? So in excavation in plan, which was quite a feat given what had to be removed from above it, and we're at about 7.5 meters below the surface here with somewhat unstable 1960s sections extending above. They were quite extensive remains, and we have dubbed these, for the meantime, Shanidar Z. So the first remains we came down onto was a very crushed but very complete skull. So hopefully you can see the lower jaw here, the upper jaw here, the eye socket, and the outline of the cranium. Below that, a very tightly flexed left wrist and forearm, the two shoulders here, and the beginnings of the rib cage with a small lithic just tucked in there. And then below that, a very complete and well-preserved rib cage. We've reconstructed that probably the burial position was something like this. So with the hand tucked in underneath the skull and a kind of reclining position. An important question is then, how do these relate to those original finds in that cluster? Are these the same, part of one of the same individuals? Is it a different individual? So this is my very crude attempt at showing you how these remains relate. So basically, the remains of this new individual, Shanidar Z, were truncated at the waist where that block was taken out. If we place it in relation to Shanidar 4, it was very close and probably just very slightly below that depth. If we look at the position of the hand, so we've got the right shoulder here and the top of the right humerus, upper arm bone just here. And that would, the right hand was over here and we were missing the right arm. Now that's very consistent with descriptions of there being right arm bones just behind the head of Shanidar 4. We've then got what was then called Shanidar 6, the legs and the feet described as being here, and some other remains here. Now, taking into account the position of the rib cage and that truncation across the waist, it would make a lot of sense that those legs could have belonged to this individual. Here, though, things get a bit tricky because that second individual was called Shanidar 6 at the time of, or just after excavation. But subsequently, other remains have been attributed to it, not necessarily on the basis that they were found in situ, because we've heard that actually a lot of the remains weren't seen in situ. So Eric Trinkhaus, who did a lot of this work, was very clear that basically remains attributed to Shanidar 4 were seen in situ and were much more clear to distinguish. Shanidar 6 basically wasn't seen in situ. So any remains that duplicated those of Shanidar 4 or that were inconsistent in terms of morphology and size were attributed to Shanidar 6 kind of by exclusion. And then again, any remains that couldn't be part of Shanidar 4 or 6 were attributed to another adult, Shanidar 8. What we can't be certain of is that the remains currently called Shanidar 6 and 8 are actually discrete individuals. They could well be mixed up. And so our hypothesis is actually that Shanidar Z is actually the upper body of what was originally described as Shanidar 6, and that these upper body remains now attributed to Shanidar 6 are perhaps another individual. To really confirm this, we need to go and look at the original remains in Baghdad, and that's something that we hope to do as part of these projects, although obviously there are various barriers to that at the moment. Other questions about this cluster, was this actually a burial? And there's been, again, debate as to whether this was an intentional and symbolic burial. Some of the evidence that came from the analysis of these remains of Shanidar Z suggests that yes, at least for Shanidar Z, we can be fairly confident that this is an intentional burial. So in this photo, here's that triangular stone, looking less triangular, as I said, and the outline of the remains here. A block for soil micromorphology was taken from here and analysed by Lucy Farr and Charlie French. And this gives us some quite clear evidence that this was probably an intentional burial. There does seem to have been a natural water channel here, but the evidence from the micromorphology suggests this was artificially enhanced, so dug out to make it larger. So what we can see in this slide here, here's two of the ribs that have actually been cut through in the preparation of that block. So they act as a nice marker of where exactly the Shanidar Z remains are. And you can see quite a difference in the sediments around the bones compared to the ones directly below. And I'm not a specialist in this, but Lucy and Charlie have informed me that there's compression of the sediments in this area here, which is consistent with digging out of, or intentionally digging out that channel. What's also really interesting is in these voids is mineralized plant tissue. We're still yet to do full analysis of these remains and be able to interpret what that might mean. But it's interesting in relation to the interpretation of potentially the flower burial, because we do have genuine ancient plant materials being preserved here. Another question I mentioned is whether this cluster represented a group of individuals who died or were buried at the same time, or whether they might have been returning to one very precise spot in the cave to deposit their dead, which could be quite significant in terms of understanding how Neanderthals viewed and used the landscape. In relation to this question, there's some interesting evidence as well. So looking here again at the Shanidar Z skull, up here, I want to draw your attention to this tooth. This is a hominin molar, and this is a CT scan of it. It's yet to be cleaned up properly, but we can see it quite clearly through the CT scan. This is a molar that cannot belong to this individual, Shanidar Z. It is, the degree of wear is inconsistent, and we actually have all of the molars for Shanidar Z. So here, in situ, this is well away from that original excavated edge, which is down at the bottom, where Solecki and his team took out the block. Here in situ, we have a loose tooth. Now, how did that get there? It could have been lost naturally and just discarded, or it could be a sign that older remains were disturbed in the deposition of Shanidar Z. Interestingly, and this is still work to be completed, below Shanidar Z, there is some sediments without any hominin bones, and below that, there are some somewhat disturbed wrist bones, but also partially articulated ribs. And this does suggest that on a separate occasion, Shanidar Z was deposited right above where another individual had been deposited sometime before. We don't know how long. But it's quite significant if we think about how large the interior of the cave is and what a concentration of individuals we have here within sort of a metre by half a metre. So how did they come back to this place, this one spot, if that's what they're doing? And there's some interesting evidence here too. So here is where the skull was found, that triangular stone here. Here is a vertical slab that's fallen from that fault in the roof, and that was in place before these sediments accumulated. This may well have acted as a marker for exactly where those remains lay. This triangular stone, as we've called it, is interesting in itself too, because it's right behind the head, and it's not really consistent with layers of rockfall. It's a bit out of, it's a bit inconsistent with the other layers around it. And this might suggest that it's intentionally placed. And again, although analyses are at an initial stage, the shaping of this does not look natural. So perhaps what we have here possibly are some markers of where that individual had been deposited. And that would explain how they could come back to this precise spot to bury more of the dead. So to conclude, I hope I've been able to show you what huge potential there is, both from the new excavations, but actually from going back to this amazing and wonderful archive from Ralph Solecki's original work at Shanidar Cave. Hopefully by combining some of our new finds, and I didn't really talk about the parts of Shanidar 5 that we have also found that are shown here, combining modern techniques, looking at, for example, calculus and analysis of DNA and diet, ancient DNA, soil micromorphology, looking at the position and the breakage of bones, and combining that with some of Solecki's extensive analyses and archives, we can perhaps get a little bit closer to understanding what was going on here at Shanidar Cave and how Neanderthals were treating their dead and viewing the wider landscape and the place of the dead within that. So just to finish up, many acknowledgements to make. The whole team at Shanidar Cave, led by Professor Graeme Barker and also Chris Hunt and Tim Reynolds. And these excavations are conducted in collaboration with the Kurdistan Regional Government and the General Directorate of Antiquities and their representatives on the site. So we're very grateful to them. The whole team, including the Canterbury All-Stars, as Professor Paul Bennett calls them, from Canterbury Archaeological Trust. The Soleckis, obviously, Molly Camp and everyone at the National Anthropological Archives who've been hugely helpful in getting this project underway. Various others who've involved on or advised on some of the analyses, and of course, all our funders. And just very finally to finish up, I wanted to say something about the Garrod connection, because this is the Garrod seminar series. Dorothy Garrod, who was Disney Professor of Archaeology here in Cambridge, did meet with Ralph Solecki to discuss the finds at Shanidar Cave. This is them together in Baghdad looking at the evidence, and Solecki was really keen to discuss this with her because she was the only other person who had conducted excavations of the Middle Paleolithic in this region of the world. In 1928, she'd excavated at Hazar Murd, which is near Sulaymaniyah, so somewhat further south. So it's really exciting to see these images of them working together on the Shanidar discoveries, and a colour photo, a little blurred here from the archive, and clearly a relationship that they maintained at future conferences. So nice just to see that connection there with Dorothy Garrod, who was of course a fellow at Newnham, where I am now as well. So with that, thank you very much. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very, very much, Emma. What a fantastic paper, and what a great finale as well. I'm sorry about the slight interruption at my end briefly. I hope it didn't put you out of your stride. I hope you didn't even notice.
No, I didn't notice anything. So you'll have to tell me what it was later.
Wonderful, and the wonderful way in which you flick between the archival deep past and much still to come, and the breaking news from the excavations of the last few years. Can I throw the questions open now, please? Do we have anything coming in on chat? That's perfect. Thank you, Laurie. There we all are. Can I invite any questions? If you don't ask something, I'm going to ask her about the flowers, and I'm sure you don't want me to do that. Yes, a question coming in. Are there publications in the works in the near future? I'm absolutely sure that there are, knowing the track record of this team. But perhaps, I don't know, who would like to field that question? Emma, over to you in the first instance.
Okay, so we've had two major papers come out this year. So yes, there's much work ongoing, nothing absolutely imminent as far as I'm aware, although Graeme might be able to correct me. But yeah, this is all ongoing work and lots of exciting stuff to come. So watch this space.
The two papers that we're sort of building up to, one's probably simply called The Age of the Shanidar Neanderthals. But the OSL dating been handled by Oxford been really problematical for a whole variety of reasons. So we're still trying to get to the point where, because the upper Neanderthals are just at the limit of radiocarbon. The ones that Emma was talking about are below that. So anyway, that's one paper that's kind of being shaped, but we're still waiting really for finalized OSL dates. And the other is something I talked about at the last ISHI conference, which is the complexity of the transition from the Neanderthals to the Barradostian archaeology, which is this Upper Paleolithic archaeology, which is, of course, it's an Aurignacian type archaeology thought to be there for modern human, but neither us nor Solecki found any fossils to go with that. That's why Eski's lab is also trying to see if they can get DNA out of the sediments down through the section. But there is very interesting evidence that we have stratigraphically there around this Shanidar, this Shanidar number 5, which is this Upper Neanderthal we've refound, which shows a kind of interleaving of archaeology and with both Mousterian and Barradostian archaeology. And so we can't say who's making the Barradostian archaeology, but what we can say is definitely people who were making Barradostian archaeology were around at the time that this Upper Neanderthal was buried. And so there's a lot of big issues about what that might be, but that's the other paper that we're kind of feeling our way towards, which is about the nature of this Middle Upper Paleolithic transition and all that's wrapped up in that, the other two. But Emma will know what's being planned on the Neanderthal side, meaning the bone side. But we're desperate, she and I, to get to Baghdad.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic, thank you, Graeme. Emma, do you want to follow up on any of that? If not, the questions are pouring in.
Yeah, I'm happy to take another question. I mean, just to say there's lots in the pipeline, but obviously access to labs, getting to Baghdad, all those kind of things have been slightly on hold for now. But yeah, we will get there.
Minor glitches, I'm sure. And in fact, what Graeme was sort of moving on to may well be a good segue into a question from Paloma de la Peña, our new colleague, who I think is at WITS at the moment. So fantastic, you could join us from South Africa. A question on what about the rest of the archaeological assemblage? Actually, Paloma, why don't you just fire away? You don't need me to read these questions out, and you can put it better than I can. And you can also explain what you mean by the broader context. So there you go, over to you.
Yes, that's my question.
So the broader archaeological question, the lithics and faunal remains that go with this particular area.
Yeah, so those analyses are all ongoing as well. The excavations have been, compared to that massive trench that Solecki excavated, the excavations now have been much smaller in scale. So things like doing sort of sampling columns and things like that. So actually the samples of things like animal bones or the lithics aren't huge, but they are telling us, as Graeme alluded to, some really interesting things about, for example, the interleaving of the Barradostian with some of the sort of Middle Paleolithic technologies. We've got a PhD student at the moment, Emily Tilby, working on some of the microfauna and looking at climatic reconstruction through that as well, and all sorts of other things going on. But yeah, I mean, I'm not quite sure what in particular you want me to comment on in terms of the archaeological context. Obviously, there's lots of different aspects of that we could discuss.
I suppose we could add that in this interleaving, it also involves perforated shells, kind of bead-like things, which Chris Hunt and Evan Hill are working on. They're definitely they're humanly made borings into them, and they're interleaved too. In terms of this Barradostian Mousterian archaeology. So again, quite what that would mean. But again, we just got to be absolutely certain of the stratigraphic associations. We should say actually, when that question was, how about all the work on the bones and the lithics, we should say that the amount of material that we have is incredibly small. The lithic sample is incredibly small from our small excavations, which again comes back to the archival work of trying to link that across in an accurate way to Ralph's copious notes is going to be really important. So the Smithsonian had some of his archive, has had it for years, but they were able to persuade him. When I visited him first in 2014, when we had to leave the project because of the ISIS attack, I went over to visit Ralph and Rose then, and there were enormous quantities of stuff in his basement. And it's that material that was transferred over before he died, which is just, as Emma said, it's a complete gold mine. So,
Jenna, I can't see you, but I can see you've got a question. Do you want to come in now?
Hi, yes. Thank you very much for a fantastic talk. I thought that was so informative. I was just wondering if any more of the infant remains showed up in any of your recent excavations. There was a nice schematic showing that there was a few infant bones. Did the rest of it ever come up?
No. So we haven't seen any more. And so Shanidar 9, which was that infant as part of that cluster, is represented really by only a few bones from the spine. And again, we don't really know where it lay in relation to those other individuals. We haven't yet found any additional remains from that individual or any other infant. It's worth noting that where we've been excavating is sort of to the side of where that block was removed. So it could well be that actually if we were able to continue excavating under where those that block was removed, that might be where the remains are. We're also not fully down to the level of where the block was kind of dug under and removed. So perhaps there are still some remains there to be found. As yet, it's just been adult remains, but as I've hinted, certainly multiple individuals, even if only one of those is more complete.
Or perhaps they're in Baghdad and you'll discover them when you're able to go and assess that material.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? The original work on the remains was extremely thorough, and there have been additional remains found since. So in the 2000s, there were some small remains of the lower leg of an infant found from elsewhere amongst the animal bones. But in general, those original analyses by both Dale Stewart and by Eric Trinkhouse were quite, were extremely thorough. So yeah, we'll see. Who knows what we'll find when we can eventually get there. It will be very exciting.
Thank you.
And we have a question from S. Gillespie on any genomic evidence as yet.
Yeah, it's a good question. And so not as yet. But so we've tried to with Eski Willislev's lab to do some analysis of the remains that we found from Shanidar 5, which I didn't talk about a great deal. With those, we've had no luck, but there what we're trying to do is extract DNA from fragments of the shaft of the tibia, essentially. Of course, we're in a part of the world there that is not necessarily the best place to preserve ancient DNA, especially when we're looking at sort of 50 to 70 plus thousand years ago. That said, we are quite excited because, again, although there's much conservation and excavation work still to be done on the skull itself, it was removed in small blocks because it's extremely fragile. So we had to consolidate it on site and then remove it. And there's more work to be done. But those initial CT scans have shown us that the petrous portion of the temporal, which is kind of the place if you're going to get DNA at all, is very well preserved on both sides. So we're quite hopeful that we might get something. And that would be quite a big deal, I think, because most of the Neanderthal DNA that we have to date is from those parts of the world that are more conducive to long-term preservation. So the Altai and further north into Europe. So if we can, it would be extremely exciting to see what comes out from these Southwest Asian Neanderthals.
Any further questions? Can I draw anyone? So, what's up with Shanidar 5? It keeps getting mentioned.
Yeah, so I saw there wasn't space to talk about all of the stuff we've been doing, so I was a bit selective about Shanidar 1 and then the Shanidar 4 cluster. So Shanidar 5 was actually, it was found at a similar level to Shanidar 1, so with a similar date. And the remains are incomplete, but parts were articulated. Now, that they were actually the first remains found by the current project of Neanderthals, which actually the current project never set out to find more remains. It was more about, you know, applying the science to the context and the dating and the environmental information and all this kind of thing. But it happened that parts of the lower leg, so the tibia, and then parts of one of the hips was also found in situ. This has allowed us to do, as I say, try at least some of the analyses that we've mentioned. It should just be on the edge of radiocarbon dating. So we have tried, but unfortunately collagen preservation is really poor. But we haven't given up on that yet with colleagues and investigating you know, new techniques as these become available. Shanidar 5 is really interesting because what Solecki interpreted was that he had been hit on the back by rockfall, fallen forwards, or that he was kneeling, he was hit on the back, fell forwards, and then more rockfall fell on him, sort of doubling him back. So we have sort of parts of the lower limbs in place, a lot of the rest of it scattered, but a reasonable skull. And that's interesting because with the new remains, but also some of the old remains, we can use these same techniques of looking at the taphonomy, for example, to say, actually, does this explanation make sense? Or, you know, can we support this idea that they were killed by rockfall? It was also mentioned in the original descriptions that the lower body seemed to be prone, so lying on its front. And actually what we found confirms, you know, it's a little bit hard to tell from the photos because they didn't take many of Shanidar 5. They were dealing already with the Shanidar 4 block and other finds, and as ever, everything turns up right at the end of the excavation and it's a bit of a rush to get it all sorted. But what we found confirms that yes, this lower part of the body was prone, which is quite interesting in terms of, you know, how we explain that position, whether the remains might have perhaps shifted and what might have been involved. So yeah, it's interesting because, again, with Shanidar 5, Solecki and Stewart did say we might well have left some bits, but we ran out of time, and that materialised. Really interestingly, looking at the archive for the Shanidar 4, 6, 8 and 9, we found a photo of the section where we found those new remains of Shanidar Z with a circle drawn on it by Solecki and a question mark saying Shanidar 10. So he knew, it turns out, that those remains were there in the section too. So it's really nice to be able to kind of unite the old and new work both in Shanidar 5 and Shanidar 4, 6, 8, 9, Z, and readdress some of these questions. And as Graeme alluded to, there's some very interesting relationships. Shanidar 5's right there, and we've got, you know, questions about the relationship between Shanidar 5, the Barbadossian or Upper Paleolithic, and the Middle Paleolithic as well, and the timing of any potential overlap. So
we have another question from Paloma. Would you like to put it yourself?
I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
We
yes.
can.
Okay. My question is regarding the phytoliths and the floral hypothesis for one of the burials, because I work at Border Cave, and we have published recently bedding and grass mats, and we have observed that there are high concentration of phytoliths. And I was wondering if you are looking this type of remains, of course, in these micromorphology blocks that you were commenting you are taking. Thank you for the presentation, by the way.
Yeah,
I loved it.
No problem. Thanks for your questions. Yes, so that is definitely something that we're working on, and we've, you know, we, as in me and the team, as we've been excavating, have sampled very extensively and very carefully for things like samples that can be used for phytoliths and other kinds of analyses to give us that kind of detailed insight that I was speaking about. That work is ongoing, so we don't have any results to report as yet, but it'll be really interesting to see what we find both around the bones, but also in other contexts, especially given we've got some of these kind of mineralized plant remains as well, and discussions around the pollen. So yes, I think there'll be exciting stuff to come from that too in the future.
Can I add to that? You know, we have sort of similar, this kind of grass bedding evidence and phytoliths and so on. In the micromorphology of Robin Inglis, we had that at the Halfatir cave in Libya. But the Shanidar occupations, both the Neanderthal, well, the upper Neanderthal, there are hearths near Shanidar 5, and then there are these Baradostian hearths. And what the micromorphology has shown there is that they're kind of one-off fires. They're a tiny group of people making a single fire. So it may be that we have got more significant, more substantial occupation down at that lower level where Emma's been working, at least this sort of 75,000 burials, because there the Neanderthal occupation evidence does look more substantial. But above that, say around the upper Neanderthal and the modern human, if it is, or Baradostian, whatever you want to call it, it's extraordinary ephemeral evidence of when people are coming into this cave. Did you see that other question I asked, Emma?
Mm-hmm.
I said the hardest bit in many ways in this cluster of burials is trying to work out the time intervals. You know, is it a day? Is it 1,000 years? You know, just we've got this group of individuals enmeshed in an area the size of a couple of chairs, and you know, to try and get at the time intervals is, and that's clearly a focus for what this Templeton grant in the field work there. What's your?
I think Marta's just suggesting you should be answering that one, Graeme, but over to Emma because you're in the hot seat today.
I was asking Emma what she thought.
Yeah, so no, I mean, it's a good question, and obviously something, I mean, it would be so wonderful if actually we could get some insight into that for that original cluster. And sadly, I don't think we can. What we can get, I think, is with these new remains, I mentioned the sort of, there's a gap underneath them, you know, some layers of sediment, and then more remains under that. So we can be, I think, fairly confident that these are separated in time. The question of how much time is a very, very difficult one. I mean, as you know better than I do, even getting the OSL dates and the dating kind of framework established well in that part of the site is proving quite tricky. And I mean, I don't know if people noticed in some of the photos, but right down sort of lower left near the remains in section is where we've taken samples for OSL dating. But yes, even the more kind of the cruder timescales, I guess, is proving a challenge, but we'll get there. How precise we can be, whether it's kind of like you say, 6 months, 6 years, 6 decades, 6,000 years, is going to be difficult. But let's see. We've still got more to excavate there and more analysis to do. So who knows?
Amélie, I think you have a question.
Yes, well, thank you, Emma, for your presentation. That was great. I was just wondering if you did notice some pathologies or something on the new specimen that would say something about the social interactions, just as the previous with the previous specimens.
Yeah, so not anything specifically yet. I mean, as I mentioned, a lot of the remains are still embedded in matrix. So I've CT scanned them and seen them clearly as clearly as possible through the CT scans, but actually the real detailed work is yet to come once they've been fully conserved and fully excavated, which is something that we'll be working on over the next year, hopefully. There's nothing specific with these remains. What I mean, we have got some indications of things like age. So this does seem to have been another substantially older individual with very, very heavy dental wear, quite extensive dental calculus on some of the teeth. So if you like, not kind of major pathologies, but indicators of a life lived that I think are going to give us some interesting insights and have all that potential for, you know, analysis of the calculus and things like that, which will come down the line. And yeah, we'll see when we get to the detail of the bones themselves too.
Emma, could I ask you a question? It's probably going to be a rather ignorant one, but it strikes me that we have very, very few on a kind of broader global scale of these very rich concentrations of human remains, hominid remains over very differentially sort of, well, not different, in very different kind of context in time and space. And they kind of stand out and they give us a disproportionately rich idea of groups of people who at least are being ending up in the same kind of place. Putting Shanidar kind of under the microscope as you've done, do you think we learn anything about the kinds of things that might explain why we are and why we aren't finding, or why we are finding some of those when we do, and why we're not finding them more often, if you see what I mean?
Kind of. I'll try and answer. I'm not sure if I quite get you, but yeah, so there, I mean, a lot of our evidence does come from a relatively small number of sites where we have sort of concentrations of individuals that are perhaps telling us something quite particular about that site or that area and that time period in that particular place. It's always a difficult one. There is undoubtedly a lot more material out there, but finding it and tracking it down and the scale of excavations needed is itself a challenge. I think that interesting, I don't know if this quite answers your question and what you're getting at, but although these are kind of very unique concentrations, if you like, I think they do tell us something about the bigger picture in a really interesting way. So, for example, when I referred to variation in funerary behaviour and how that varies in modern human populations, I mean, perhaps, and this is what various people have said, including us in one of our more recent papers, perhaps what we should be thinking about is not expecting like consistent behaviour across this huge range and time span for Neanderthals, but we should be expecting variation, and that's interesting in itself. And comparing the different sites, places like Shanidar or La Ferracie, Krapina, we do see in some cases commonalities, in some cases big differences. And I think if we think carefully about those and in depth, that might actually help us to understand and demonstrate this kind of geographic and temporal variation, which would make much more sense if these behaviours are something symbolic and cultural, much as they are in modern human populations.
Can I ask a question?
Please do.
Yeah, and I think it follows nicely from your reply to see one of the puzzling things for me at the moment with the Neanderthal research is to think where the population was actually resilient. So the genomic data are clear that Neanderthals go through episodes of boom and serious bust. And there was, in the last paper, the Mafesoni paper, where they did the Chargitskaya genome, and they show the complexity of the genomic relationships amongst the Neanderthals. And there was another paper by Kolobova, I believe, who looked at the lithics and said that actually in the lithics, they could also see this repeated pattern of affinities towards the West. But it's also not clear where in Western Eurasia these Neanderthals have a permanent residence, put it that way. And it may be the case that they never have a permanent residence, that itself fluctuates through time. Mm-hmm. And certainly it wasn't Mezmezkaya, the other side of the Caucasus. So what is your view of that area of the Zagros? Could that have been a long-term resilient survivorship spot for Neanderthals?
I mean, it's a really interesting point, and these questions of population dynamics and exactly how that's playing out over time and space is, I think, something that, to some extent, the genetics has brought up more questions than answers. In terms of the Zagros, I mean, particularly in terms of Shanidar, as Graeme mentioned, the occupations, if we can call them that, or the use of the cave does seem to be
pretty continuous.
Quite, for short periods and quite temporary. Okay. So specifically in relation to Shanidar, it doesn't seem like you've got intense activity there. Now, what that means, again,
Yeah,
we'll
but that
take a
it could,
bigger view of...
yeah, there could even be a local transhumance pattern.
Well, that's what I was going to say. You need that regional perspective.
Exactly.
Maybe they're based somewhere else and coming there for, you know, a week each summer or that, you know, I mean, that's
the plains and the mountains, yeah. And do you have any signal from the Zagros Mousterian, from the Mousterian lithics in the cave, that there could be discontinuities?
I mean, that's probably not a question for me. I don't know if Tim Reynolds is here and is able to comment a bit more. Possibly not. I know
they've abandoned you, Emma. Not even an attempt at helping you. Sorry. Okay, abandon the lithics question.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I think that others in the team will be much better placed to answer. But again, as Graeme mentioned, we're dealing with quite small assemblages,
sample sizes,
just because of the nature of the excavations. And while some of Solecki's material is available, I think, if I recall correctly from talking to Graeme and Chris and others, it does seem that perhaps even the retention of what there is has been rather selective, and how representative that is another question. So,
okay, thank you. Lovely talk.
Tim was hoping to. Well, he's looked at the quite a lot of the Solecki material in the Smithsonian. I mean, the site, from what we can tell, it's occupied briefly, successively, periods when the climate is roughly like it is today. And I mean, nowadays, I mean, the people that lived in the cave were transhumant shepherds who went up into the high Zagros, the borders of Iran and Turkey, in the summer, were down in the lower Zab in the winter. And certainly the Zab connects you to a wider world that takes you right up into eastern Turkey. And there are little bits of obsidian that are in the Mousterian layers, not just the Baradostine layers, which connect up to the Lake Van, to eastern Turkey. So, you know, this cave is part of a much wider world. We see this specialness of this little group of this repeated use for burial, but at the same time, it looks like it's relatively, they're short visits.
Yeah.
We can see.
I mean, my understanding, I mean, there's really interesting work being done in that arc of mountains from the Zagros to the Caucasus, with the obsidian, the distribution of obsidian and the sourcing of obsidian, which is different in North and South Caucasus, for example, and which point to aerial occupations that differ. So yeah, super interesting.
Emma, Graeme, I have a feeling we're going to have you back many, many times to keep quizzing you over the coming years. This is very exciting indeed. In the meantime, could I thank Emma very much indeed on behalf of all of us for a fabulous talk. Many answers, many questions. And before we disperse, could I also just thank you all for coming and very warmly invite you to join us again next week when it's Kat, isn't it? Kat, you're on next week. When Kat Coops will be speaking to us. So thank you very, very much indeed. Have a good evening, stay safe and well, and thank you again, Emma. Goodbye from me.